Welcome to this session. Our next one will be 3 weeks from today, and we will discuss the national security implications of the developments that we're talking about. Let me put this into a brief background setting. In many ways, I think we are at a hinge of history, comparable to the time right after World War II. You remember those days, at least a few of you, as I do. People could look back, and what did they see? They saw 2 world wars. The first one settled in rather vindictive terms that led to the second. They saw 60 million people were killed in the Second World War. They saw the Holocaust. They saw the Great Depression. They saw the currency manipulation and protectionism that aggravated it. And they said to themselves, what a crummy world. But they learned something from the First World War. After the First World War, you remember, the United States withdrew. In the case post-Second World War, we said, it's a crummy world, but we're part of it whether we like it or not. And so we gave leadership, not telling people what to do, but getting leadership. There were 44 countries at Bretton Woods where the basic economic rules of the game were laid out. Then we had the Cold War, NATO, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that by the time the Cold War came to an end, there had been created, with a lot of leadership from the United States, a security and economic commons in the world from which everybody benefited. In those days, we thought win-win. You didn't have to have somebody lose in order to win. So everybody won. Well, we're at a similar junction right now. The world is in disarray. The demographic changes that are taking place are astonishing, big time important. The technology is coming. It's come before, but this time it's coming relatively rapidly. And just as all this is taking place, we have the threat of climate change, we have the threat of nuclear weapons, and we have a situation where governance seems to be more and more difficult as a result of some of these developments. National government, let alone international government. So our effort in this project is to understand all these developments better in order to come up with some ideas for what to do best about it. And today our focus is on Europe, and Jim Wilsey has put all this, Jim Hoagland has put all this together, and we'll take over. Jim?
George, thank you. Hi, I'm Jim Hoagland. I'm a visiting fellow at Hoover and spent most of my career at the Washington Post. We have 4 excellent speakers this afternoon. We spent the day, as George Schultz has indicated, going over the megatrends of new technology, of demographic change, of climate change that are affecting an emerging new world. I'm going to give you a brief biographical descriptions of our speakers, and then we'll move straight into the discussion and a lively interchange with the audience. On my far right is Bill Drozdiak, who is at Brookings Institution and also occupies a position at McClarty and Associates, and was president of the American-German Council for a long time. Caroline Atkinson, to my right, is an international economic policymaker who has worked both at the White House in the Obama administration and at Google. On my left is Nicole Perlroth, technology correspondent for the New York Times. I'm sure you've read her articles, and you'll get a chance to discuss with her the very latest things that are going on in the technological sphere. And finally, Chris Caldwell, who is contributing editor at the Claremont Review and has written a very good book called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, and will speak to us mostly about demographics, but also anything else that you want to ask about. We'll start with Bill Drozdiak.
Well, thank you, Jim. Well, I'll give a brief synopsis of my paper. It was based on Europe's challenges in an era of social media, advanced technologies, and artificial intelligence. And my thesis is that while Europe is currently the world's most powerful commercial bloc, is falling woefully behind in terms of these new technologies. Of the top 15 digital companies in the world, all are American or Chinese. Of the top 200, only 8 are Europeans. And if you look at the geopolitical competition going out over the next few years, you see Russia, China, and the United States posing the biggest problems from Europe. Russia, in terms of its hybrid warfare techniques, Vladimir Putin has realized that he can sow a lot of confusion and mischief in Western democracies by using hackers through denial of services and other means to interfere with elections, as he did here in the United States in 2016, or in various elections in just about every country of Europe. And the advantage for Russia, which has limited resources, even though it is a powerful oil and gas country, the advantage for Russia is that these these instruments are very cheap. So it can use hybrid warfare in ways that can have profound consequences for our Western democracies. The meddling in our 2016 election campaigns, according to the Special Prosecutor's Office, cost Russia less than $1 million. It's done similar efforts in trying to disrupt elections in France, in Germany, in Italy, and it also had a role in trying to meddle with the Brexit referendum in Britain. So how we come up with a deterrent to Vladimir Putin is a big question right now, and I think Nicole will be able to address that because she covers these issues for the New York Times. The second big challenge is from China, and that's a different kind of strategic threat in that China is in the process of acquiring key infrastructure assets. They're going around buying up, such as the port of Piraeus near Athens, a number of energy, gas, infrastructure projects in Portugal and other countries. They purchased the biggest robotics company in Germany with 14,000 employees, which makes all of the state-of-the-art robotics that build automobiles there, with the idea of transferring this technology to China. They also bought very cheaply the magnetic levitation technology when Germany refused to go ahead and deploy this on their own soil. They shipped it to China, and they've been able to build these train lines without much public opposition. So China is in the process of really picking off the crown jewels of Europe in a number of key areas. And they are trying to build out, wire the world, and in particular in Europe with the 5G networks in ways that some experts fear they could use as a backdoor into for espionage purposes in terms of undermining Europe's democracies. And lastly, from the United States, Europe is troubled by the prominence and power of the American technology giants, and is trying to find ways to regulate them. They passed last May the most profound data privacy rules that are now being applied in such a way that it's constricting the activities of companies like Facebook and Google. Recently, France just fined Google $50 million for violating this code. So it is seen in by the US government as a way of punishing the most effective and powerful companies we have in a form of protectionism. The Europeans say they're protecting their own data privacy. And there will be other efforts to regulate cyber activity that Europe hopes will become a global model. And I think these are challenges that could lead to a further rupture in our relations with Europe and thus damaging the transatlantic partnership as we try to preserve the primacy of Western democracies in the face of rising authoritarian challenges from Russia, China, and other places.
Bill, as I listened to you run through that impressive list of the things the Chinese are trying to do in Europe, I couldn't help asking myself, and now to ask you, what are they doing? Why do you think they are putting so much emphasis on artificial intelligence, on acquiring European assets? What's the game?
Well, I think with artificial intelligence, the most important factor is the accumulation of massive amounts of data. And with a population of 1.4 billion, they've already acquired this. In fact, they have realized that in terms of an authoritarian, one-party culture, there are strategic advantages in using artificial intelligence, which will magnify many times over the recent achievements of advanced technologies. For example, they're already monitoring their population on an individual basis in terms of whether they are behaving properly through biometric control and other means, and they realize that they can acquire these technologies from Europe much easier even than in the United States through strategic investments there. Just this past year, China invested 9 times as much money in Europe as it did in the United States.
Thank you. Caroline, tell us a little bit about the European decision, or perhaps lack of a decision, to compete with either the United States or China in these technological areas. Is this something that they have adopted a different approach to?
Yes, and there's an irony here, because certainly Europe has not done well in digital technology. And somebody said in the debate this morning, an important German businessman commented that Europe has lost the first half of the digital technological revolution game. Bill gave some data on that. But at the same time, there's been a lot of, lip service, a lot of commentary in Europe about the importance and the opportunity that there could be from opening up Europe to digital technology. And it's been welcomed rhetorically, for sure. There's been a big effort by the European Commission in Brussels to promote a thing called the digital single market. In Germany, there was a big effort to promote the Internet of Things, Industry 4.0. And in Paris, both the latest President Macron, the current president, had a special conference to encourage innovation and entrepreneurs to work on what's called GovTech, which are the technological ways that companies can help government become more efficient. And way back 7-8 years ago, Sarkozy invited a lot of tech leaders to Paris and to join in with the meetings that he was hosting of other leaders to promote technology. However, despite this rhetorical call and comments about how much adoption and fostering of innovation could help Europe, the European approach to digital technology, crudely put, has been regulate, legislate, and tax. And perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the potential innovators and entrepreneurs inside Europe have found their way elsewhere, often to the United States, often to here in Silicon Valley. Sometimes they just moved across the channel to London. But they have, these are not the conditions that promote entrepreneurship or digital technology. Now, I think there's a question for Europe going forward about how this will manifest itself in the coming years, and whether some of the characteristics that have contributed to Europe's approach so far might have a different impact going forward. And I'll just briefly mention 4 of them. One is that in Europe, the economic structure is more heavily focused on industry and less on services, relatively speaking, than in the United States. So the engineering prowess of Germany, the educational prowess in France, is not the kind of background that has supported consumer-facing technology and innovation such as we've had here in the United States. Linked to that, there are very close relationships between incumbent businesses in Europe and governments. So they don't tend to want to promote newcomers so much as to help make sure that the newcomers don't take away too much, don't eat the lunch of the existing incumbents. Now, part of that is also brought together by the fact that in Europe there is a much stronger social insurance programs, there is a better education system, there is more training than in the United States. And those factors limit flexibility of workforces and so on, and tend to perpetuate the kind of companies that you already have. But at the same time, those might be the kinds of characteristics that will be useful in what many see as the next phase of innovation with artificial intelligence, robotics, challenging work. And we know there's been a lot of discussion in the United States about what's going to happen to work, what's going to happen to workers, what's going to happen to problems of inequality. Maybe the European, more statist approach could help to support the politics, if you like, and the political economy of the sorts of changes that may be coming. And then the 4th issue, which I don't think is going to be has not been helpful and won't be helpful, is the nature of the financial sector in Europe. It's much more heavily bank-based. There isn't a venture capital system, and that links also to societal and political issues. There is a fear of failure, not a sort of recognition that that can be a badge of honor for an entrepreneur. And I don't see that changing. And we had an interesting comment this morning from a venture capitalist here that he and his firm were very interested in looking at Europe, but didn't find the kinds of conditions there that made it attractive. So looking ahead, I think it's a big question for Europe whether they will manage to create the conditions that will encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, which is definitely could be of value to their economies. They will need to be ready to tear down barriers rather than develop more regulations and so on. And they will need to perhaps give up on the idea of developing a European Google or a European Amazon, and instead just make sure to encourage the startups that could be homegrown.
Very good. Now I want to turn to Nicole. Nicole, this cyber world that the United States has done so much to create, how is the U.S. doing in managing it?
Well, not so well recently. We, there was, so within cybersecurity, there's been a couple developments over the last 5 years that actually have been rather successful in deterring cyber attacks. Excuse me. The first is the agreement between former President Obama and President Xi to agree not to conduct cyber attacks for the purpose of industrial espionage. And that agreement was formed in 2015. And it actually had a huge effect on curbing cyber attacks from China. So before that, there was a saying in the cybersecurity world, you may have heard or may have not heard, that there were only 2 types of companies left in the United States: companies that had been hacked by China and companies that didn't know they'd been hacked by China yet. So since this agreement in 2015, there was actually a major drop-off in the number of cyber attacks aimed at stealing industrial trade secrets. Well, one of the developments recently with the escalation in the US-China trade war is that that agreement has effectively been annulled. And you won't have seen this in any sort of official statements. This is just from my own reporting at the New York Times and stories I'm working on now. But if you talk to lawyers who handle cybersecurity breaches and trade law, they'll tell you that they are getting a lot of business right now from companies in the Fortune 100 because of breaches aimed at trade secret theft. And that actually that agreement is effectively gone, and we're seeing a huge resurgence. Only the difference now is that the attacks are much more sophisticated. So whereas before the attacks coming from China were conducted usually by a group called PLA Unit 61398 that we've written about at the New York Times, the Chinese have actually reorganized internally, and a lot of these attacks are coming from the Chinese Ministry of State Security using many more stealth methods and tactics. So that's one just development that's happened that you won't read about in sort of the news of the escalating US-China trade war. The other thing that's happened is that the abandonment of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, has had a huge amount of collateral damage in cyber. So the best thing that we did in deterring very destructive attacks out of Iran, and by the way, you might remember a couple of years ago, it was Iranian hackers who took out Sands Casino, computers at Sands Casino, and also 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco, the world's biggest oil company. Well, the best thing that happened in terms of deterrence for cyber attacks from Iran was the JCPOA, because suddenly the Iranians had something to lose. Well, since we've abandoned that deal, we just had, just in the last few weeks, one of the more aggressive attacks from Iran on the backbone of the internet, the internet's domain name system. So there too, all bets are off, and we're now facing a renewed threat of Iranian cyber attacks. So, and then there's Russia, of course, which has learned how to, basically has found its sweet spot in not just American partisan politics and disinformation campaigns, but has been using this playbook now across Europe with much success. So we're at a place now where what is the US doing to deter these attacks across the globe? The answer is nothing. They're really not doing anything. We've actually recently, John Bolton eradicated the White House cybersecurity coordinator position. We have an administration that is reticent to call out Russia, or at least a president who's reticent to call out Russia for some of the cyber attacks on our election system, and blames them on a 400-pound hacker in a basement somewhere. And then we've only lightly sanctioned Russia, and in fact, just recently rolled back some of the sanctions. So that's why I actually think this question today is very critical. What is Europe's role in the emerging world and economy? And I think it is now, despite some of the doom and gloom that we discussed today about Russia sort of missing the first half of the digital revolution, there is actually a huge place for Europe right now in setting up and putting out the norms of what we can do with regards to cyber war. And actually, I did see some room for optimism. I came today as an observer. I had not prepared a paper, but there were things that were said today that first shocked me. Someone mentioned a poll that in Germany, they now see the United States as tantamount to Russia in terms of a threat, which I just found incredibly depressing. But within Europe, there is some room for optimism. I mean, I learned that in terms of, there's no superstar European tech companies right now, with a few exceptions that were noted today, like Spotify and F-Secure, a major Finnish security company, and others. But actually, Europe is pretty well positioned to take on the second half of the digital revolution. So Jens Südekum, who is, I think it's 3 a.m. or so there, but he spoke today from Germany, mentioned that in Germany there's 8 robots per 1,000 workers, which is 4 times as many as we have in the United States. and that for every manufacturing job lost in Europe, there's one gained in the service sector. And that actually there's just been a trend towards reshoring, bringing some of the manufacturing back to Germany from places like Bangladesh and Vietnam, which I thought was very interesting. And then just from an education apprentice perspective, in Germany, they're much more focused on vocational training and apprentice programs than we are here in the United States. So they've actually been pretty smart about training workers for the automation and IoT economy. And it sounds like their workforce is actually much more flexible in doing so or adapting to this than we are here in the United States. So from that perspective, I actually did not think I would walk away from today saying this, but I actually think there was quite a bit of room for optimism when it comes to how Europe can tackle the second half of the digital revolution. And when you look at sort of bringing it back to cyber norms and responsibilities and perhaps a Geneva Convention for cyber warfare, I really think at this juncture it's going to have to be the European Union that sets some of these standards for what's acceptable and what's unacceptable and what will draw a response and what won't draw a response, particularly now that the United States has sort of abandoned its moral authority on some of these topics.
Chris Caldwell, what's the future look like for Europe in terms of demographic trends?
Well, demography is something that underpins all these technological questions, and Europe has about the worst kind of demographic problem that you can have, which is that it's not reproducing itself. It has women in Europe are having fewer children. Normally, in a sort of a country with stable population, the average woman will have 2.1 children statistically in her lifetime, and that tends to keep the population in balance. In Europe, some of these countries have fallen to historic lows in terms of family formation and childbearing. So you have Germany, Italy, Spain. These have fallen to about 1.3 children per woman, which sounds like a statistical nothing, but in fact what it means is that each succeeding generation will be a third smaller than the last one. And when that happens, you have certain problems, particularly in countries that are indebted. Italy, for instance, has the second largest government debt in the world, aside from the United States, and it does not have the reserve currency. So Italy is going to have to pay off this debt, which many people think is already unpayable, with about 10% fewer workers. And you can already see the evidence of this collapsing population in Europe. If you look at Airbnb, now has a program where they're trying to get their people who use it to volunteer to go to a town in Basilicata in southern Italy, a town called Grottole. It's an ancient medieval town. It was a big town in the Middle Ages. It had like 13,000 people in the Middle Ages, but it now has 300 people, and it's got 600 houses that are empty and that were occupied recently, that can be saved if someone goes to live in them, but there's just no one who's living in them in that town. So they're trying to Airbnb is trying to bring people in to rescue those houses. There's a city in France that I was in December, in Burgundy, called Clamecy. Outside of Clamecy, you can buy a two-story house with a business on the ground floor for about $15,000, which is really a good deal, but it's a sign of how weak the population growth is in that area. So really, you have a rapidly declining population. When you get into that position, there are basically three options that Europe has. It can just roll with it and say, okay, we're a shrinking country. And although that creates difficulties and probable defaults in the countries that are in debt, it does have its bright side. It means, these are prosperous countries. Automation can handle some of the shortfall from lost labor force. It's better for the environment, okay? So the one possibility is to shrink. The second possibility is to try and get women and families to have more children. That's questionable, how effective programs like that can be. And on top of that, Europeans tend to be very distrustful of natalist policies because of their association with the eugenics movement and some unsavory ideologies before and during World War II. And then finally, there's immigration. Immigration, as we know in this country, can bring great benefits. It can also cause great social dislocations, particularly in the quantity in which Europe needs it. And so right now, Europe is in the midst of a very large wave of immigration. And one of the things that we talked about today that maybe I can talk about later on was some of the dislocations that causes.
Chris, thank you. We do want to move to the question and answer session now. There are microphones around. We would ask that you identify yourself and state any affiliation that you have. It's a little difficult to see from up here, but I'm ready to entertain requests to take the floor and to discuss with us this mixed picture of Europe having promise in some ways that the United States might want to emulate on technology, but also having big problems. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Steve Rock, and I have a question for the first speaker. He mentioned that a huge fraction of the technology companies were in the United States and China, and only a few percent in Europe. Yet China was buying mostly European countries, companies, rather than American. So there must be something desirable in Europe which the Chinese are buying, which they find more desirable than the companies in the US. So what is this great desirability of the high technology in Europe, even though they're failing to compete with the United States?
Question for Bill Drozdiak.
I think the answer is that Europe represents the key culmination of the Belt and Road Initiative that China set out with this plan, seeking to have access to the most lucrative and largest commercial bloc in the world, that is the European Union, more than 500 million affluent citizens. And the way of doing this, it was to acquire key infrastructure such as the Port of Piraeus and building high-speed rail so that they could ship their goods into the center of Europe, the heart of Europe. And acquiring these infrastructure sites as well as the key technologies that Europe has developed on a research basis. Where Europe has been weak, as Caroline indicated, has been in the commercial exploitation of them, in building companies that can capitalize on the research breakthroughs that have been developed in Europe. In many cases, even here in Silicon Valley, the large technology companies are scouring Europe for research breakthroughs that they could use themselves. And China has recognized this and realized, at least until recently, that there was much less political pushback that they would receive in Europe than they have been getting in the United States.
Bill, could you go into a little more detail on, you said until recently, the Europeans haven't adopted the kind of restrictive foreign investment laws that the U.S. has. Has that changed?
Right. I think it's starting to change. The alarm bells went off. I mentioned the robotics company KUKA, which was acquired by a Chinese company, and most recently the controversy over the 5G networks that Huawei wants to build out in Europe. Huawei is trying to wire the world and make, so it is assumed in terms of the strategy, make markets in Europe, Asia, and Africa beholden to Chinese economic power. The Huawei case is that in 2017, China passed a law requiring citizens and corporations to cooperate in all ways possible for the Chinese government in terms of access to information. And this is what has raised alarm bells in Europe, that if Huawei installs the latest communications networks in places like Germany, France, and Britain, that it would have a backdoor into all communications and information in Europe, and this could be exploited for political and economic purposes. And this is already happening. The Chinese have been very effective in dividing and conquering markets in Europe. For example, in Eastern Europe, where there is great eagerness on the part of governments to attract Chinese investment, they've actually been competing with each other to welcome Chinese investment. And the Chinese have recognized this, and now every year they have what is called the 16+1 summits, 16 Eastern and Central European countries and their leaders meeting with the Chinese leadership as a way to see how they can further Chinese economic involvement.
Thank you. Herbert Band, a Stanford DCI fellow. In Europe, data privacy seems to be a highly emotional issue, maybe much the way the Second Amendment is in this country. And clearly there are concerns about under-regulating data privacy, but there are also concerns about over-regulating it. And a lot of people are concerned that Europe maybe hasn't set the regulation in the right place. My question is, how does Europe manage to have a real conversation about how do you regulate data privacy in a way that will enable a digital technology, digital health models, et cetera, to thrive, but will still provide an adequate level of data privacy protection?
Caroline?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in a sense, they've rushed to enact the GDPR, as Bill commented. And there are concerns that this will prove too restrictive. In particular, sort of two elements. One, the quite broad right to be forgotten, which enables people to say, well, I don't want this search to yield these results about me and my name. And then the other is that if you, as many of you in this audience would know, if you restrict the use to which data can be put, you're closing off potential uses, especially in this world that we're moving into of artificial intelligence and machine learning and different ways of using data for what can be generally recognized as social goods. In other words, not just digital advertising, but medical advances and so on. And I think what's quite interesting is not just what's been happening in Europe, but what's happening right now in the United States, because it's certainly the case that some of the concerns that Europe has had for a long time about tech companies are now being voiced here in the US. And as you know, in California, there's moved to have a privacy law. There's the tech companies have pretty much accepted that there will be federal legislation, or that they're even advocating federal legislation to try to have legislation that they feel ready to live with. But there's not agreement within the tech community. Apple and Salesforce and some others are saying, yes, we should, GDPR is terrific. And that's partly because they have a different business model from the companies that rely a lot, like Google and Facebook in particular, and others on the use of data. So I think this will be a very interesting area to watch. And somebody actually this morning commented to me that they didn't really believe there was such a concern about privacy in Europe, that it was more reflecting a kind of protectionist desire to restrict American companies. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I do think that looking forward, and I'll end with this point, it's likely that there will be more scope for European companies to be developing using artificial intelligence and machine learning and marrying that to industrial production with the Internet of Things. And that will require a lot of use of data. And I think there's a question of whether that business interest in freer use of data might harness some opposition to the general cry for very strict governance of data privacy.
Caroline, I think you were being quite diplomatic in not saying that it's Apple's Tim Cook,
Yes.
who is basically leading a charge now to criticize those companies such as Facebook and Google that depend on advertising revenue, that use the data that they assemble to place ads, targeted ads.
Yeah, well, Tim Cook has made quite has been a champion of privacy, probably for genuine reasons, but it's also clear that there has been a kind of competitional fight between him and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and that sparring against each other on this issue has been a part of it. Apple sells, I mean, they're trying to make more of their services part of their business now, but they basically a company that sells hardware, and that's very different from the business model behind Facebook or Google. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that, especially in Europe, but here as well, there's a sort of, and maybe especially in Washington, not so much on the West Coast, there's a sort of bundling together of a group of companies called FANGs, you know, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, or GAFA, and they really have quite different business models, and people often don't really understand what the business model is. I remember when I was working at Google and went to Germany, and people were saying, well, anyway, we don't even know what Google does. I mean, are you now making cars? And how do you make money? And do you make money on the search? And so there's, and we saw in the Senate, in the hearings at the Senate that Mark Zuckerberg went to, when a senator was sort of asking him how on earth Facebook could manage to make money, and he said, we sell ads, Senator. So there is a big gulf in understanding, and there is also a big difference in the business interests of companies that are often just pushed together as one.
I have a question for Nicole, but if there's a question from the audience, I'll defer to this young lady right here.
Hi, my name is Fiorella. I'm an undergraduate here, philosophy and math, and I was wondering, what do you guys mean when you say Europe? Because I'm assuming it's the European Union, obviously, but there are countries that are in the periphery, not physically, but like economically. So when you guys talk about a possible way of fixing the population issue with immigration, do you mean by countries of the periphery of Europe, in this economic periphery, or do you mean like other countries?
Good question. Yep. The technology piece is primarily relates to the European Union, but there's a distinction that Chris draws. In fact, what do you mean by Europe?
Right. When I talk about it statistically, I often do use the statistics from the European Union, but I would say that there are a couple of different ways to do it. I am speaking generally, when I speak about immigration, about Europe as a cultural space. You know, there has been a Western Europe has been using immigration for certain needs for the last 50 or 55 years now. Eastern Europe has not. And Eastern Europe, what we used to call Eastern Europe, what we now call Central Europe, I would say, has shown some resistance to welcoming immigrants. There's another confusing aspect of this, which is that you have the European Union, right, which was sort of first started in 1957 at the Treaty of Rome as just sort of an idea of bringing people together around an already existing steel and coal union. And that starting in 1992 began to move towards what they call an ever closer union. It's the union has reached a point now that a lot of people consider it their country, so there are certain people in Europe, not a majority by any means, who've ceased to think of people moving from France to Germany as being migrants or immigrants, okay? So I can, whatever one thinks of the European Union, that I can see that point. The problems I'm talking about trying to fill lost manpower and trying to respond to sort of like humanitarian needs of war-torn countries and things. Those things generally involve migration from outside the European Union. I'm not in general talking about people coming from Russia, for instance, or from Norway, or places like that are outside the actual union. I mean mostly people from the Middle East. That's been the traditional extra-European group over the last half a century. That began, I would say, when there were certain countries that had plans to bring labor from outside Europe, from poorer parts of Europe into Northern Europe, and those included Germany formally, okay? But there were also countries, Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands also had less formal type programs like that. They started in using laborers from Italy and Yugoslavia, but those were the early stages of the beginnings of decline, a population in decline, and they kind of ran out of people. And they began to seek migrants from Turkey. And then there was another issue, which was the implosion of colonial empires, the Algerian War in 1962, which brought a great rush of people into France. So for the most part, we've been talking about the Middle East and North Africa when we talk about immigrants from outside of Europe. But increasingly, we're beginning to talk about people from sub-Saharan Africa, which is about to undergo the largest sort of population explosion that any place in the world ever has. Yeah.
So, Nicole, I feel like we ought to have a little sign here saying breaking news based on what you told us earlier, particularly about the abrogation, I guess it is, of the Chinese-American agreement on cyber attacks. What can you tell us about, I gathered from your remarks that the Chinese have now resumed attacks in response to the United States canceling the agreement, or what's the sequence?
I think the sequence is, we had this rush of cyber attacks that we're still discovering around the 2014-2015 time frame, and universally the one that's considered the worst was the Chinese breach of the Office of Personnel Management, which was when they stole personnel files on just about everyone who'd ever sought a security clearance here in the United States. And the U.S. was preparing sanctions based on that attack, and that's really what led to this agreement. And then we saw this sort of drop off over the last couple of years on cyber attacks just aimed at industrial trade secret theft. But since we have now had this sort of escalating Sino-U.S. Trade war, effectively, apparently, when you talk to these lawyers that come in and groups like Mandiant that come in and respond to cybersecurity breaches, they say business is pretty good right now. and that a lot of these attacks are aimed at like I said earlier, the Fortune 100. Only these are not these sort of traditional spear phishing type attacks where you get a misspelled email from someone with a malicious link or attachment. There's actually been a move towards more sophisticated methods. And actually, one little interesting anecdote is that usually I'd go to these hacker conferences in Canada and all over the place where they would have these big competitions, and always these teams from Tencent in China would win these hacking competitions, actually to break the Google Chromebook and Apple MacBook and OS. And those security researchers or hackers are no longer going to those conferences internationally anymore because China has basically said you can no longer attend these security conferences. That their skills are considered of great asset inside China right now, and those guys aren't doing spear phishing attacks. Those guys are doing really sophisticated, some more stealth type attacks. So that's that's what's happening on that front. And then, like I said, we've sort of resorted to hearing about these more aggressive attacks out of Iran, which had dropped off over the last couple of years, and most recently on the internet's domain name system. And I think we're going to start seeing more of those as well.
When the lawyers tell you that they are very busy these days, that's never a good sign.
Yeah, right.
Caroline.
I was just going to comment that I happened to be working in the White House at the time of the agreement with China. And after that had been reached, the president turned to me and said, well, why don't we get that agreed more broadly in the G20, which includes not Iran, but also Russia and some other countries. And the meeting was coming up rather soon, so this was a challenging assignment. But we managed we managed to sort of replicate that language and that agreement. And there are two interesting facts about the efforts to do that. One were the Russians were by far the most difficult to get on board. And they basically, it was a sort of bullying and shaming and soft power and all the rest of it. And then I also discovered that through friends from Canada, Germany, and elsewhere, that the Chinese, my counterpart from China in these discussions, was quietly going around and telling everybody else that they should absolutely not join this agreement, even though China themselves had signed along. So, it's important to use soft power to get these agreements, and it's not been abrogated in a formal way. It's just that, as Nicole says, the sort of adherence to norms of behavior has become less as there's more open competition and rivalry and disagreement.
So in the end, the Russians agreed to the G20?
In the end, the Russians agreed, yes.
But didn't observe it?
Well, they did for a while.
Okay.
Yeah,
until they didn't. Sir.
Mikio Ishimaru. I'm a retired intellectual property attorney with my own law firm. Okay, and I guess I look at the title, Governance in an Emerging New World. And, Mr. Schultz said we learned things from the previous war, so we were able to improve things in the world. We're talking now about cyber warfare. Do we actually have a cyber war going on? If so, then what would be the best approach, for example, for our government to use in order to be able to learn from what's been going on and improve the worldwide situation so that the governance of the world will be improved?
That's an excellent question that we've wrestled with in each of the 6 roundtable discussions that we've had. And so maybe everybody can chip in a little bit on that, starting with Bill.
Well, I think the challenge to come up with an international or multilateral code of conduct that would govern governments and private sector companies in the years to come is going to be one of the most fiendishly difficult assignments imaginable. Some 60 years ago, I think John F. Kennedy looked at the situation with nuclear proliferation and expected in a couple of decades that there would be 80 countries with nuclear weapons. Well, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been remarkably successful in restricting the number of nuclear powers to, 6 declared and 3 non-declared. But the key to that was an agency, International Atomic Energy Agency, and intrusive inspections, because the nature of nuclear technology is that you can go in and take, just within the proximity of research centers, that take soil and air samples, and from the isotopes determine whether there is bomb-making efforts going on inside. So that is a way of confirming whether you can prevent or the breaking of these treaties. Something like artificial intelligence, as Caroline said earlier, it has a multiplicity of dual-use technologies. If you can detect pathogens in the blood and find cancer, that's good. And you want to encourage the proliferation of that technology. But if that technology can also be used to have intrusive surveillance of your populations, as we're seeing China doing it with, then that can be malicious and evil. So how we control these technologies in the years to come is really going to be I think, one of the most challenging assignments imaginable for governments and policymakers.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that there are possibilities for not so much a legal. I guess I'm pessimistic about the possibility of legal treaties. It's just very hard to imagine in the United States, never mind in all of the other countries, a formal agreement at the moment to some treaty that limited US power. But I do think it's possible to think of establishing norms of behavior, having discussions, bringing in the private sector and governments as well. And as Nicole said, we had some success. There was some success around the agreement between China and the United States, and then the G20 agreement around reducing cyber attacks for commercial use. But all of that behavior, agreeing to norms and so on, does rely on trust amongst nations, and I think we are, as the Secretary Schultz said, at a dangerous hinge point, because we're seeing unusual behaviors, whether it's poisoning of people in the rural town in the United Kingdom, or I think some in China would say, what about the arresting of the CFO of Huawei? Others in Canada might say, what about our Canadian diplomats that have disappeared? There's a kind of worrying trend of unusual and undiplomatic behavior that makes this a very difficult time. But maybe it also makes it a time where we do need to try even harder. And I think that we don't have the way of testing in the soils and so on for nuclear materials. But as Nicole pointed out, there are a lot of experts who are pretty good, including private sector ones, at figuring out when these sorts of intrusions are going on. And there is a big effort on artificial intelligence to develop ethical guidelines. And Merkel actually called for that in last month in Davos, but she did accept, and this brings us back to the European thing, she added that for Europe to play a role in the development of these ethical standards, we need to be actors in the industry. So,
Nicole, you spend a lot of time with technology companies in Silicon Valley and cybersecurity companies. What is the general view of the people you talk to from those companies about an effort to establish international norms?
First, can I just answer your question? Because I think it's a really good one. I think before the 2016 election, I would have said we were locked in sort of a détente, where, frankly, the United States is as implanted in some of the systems inside China and Russia as they are in our systems. And so if they were to launch an attack that took out a utility, we would probably be able to do the same. But what happened, and I think this is really interesting because it doesn't come up a lot in these discussions, what happened actually was the North Korea attack on Sony, where they hacked the executives' emails, they released them into the public domain, and next thing you saw executives getting let go, you saw people just on Twitter going crazy, and it created this big playbook actually for the Russian interference in the 2016 election, where they learned, first of all, for the Sony attack, there were significant discussions inside the Obama administration about whether to call that an act of cyber war, to get to your original question, and they went with cyber vandalism. They did not want to escalate it to that level. And there are very important liability reasons for this. Like, for example, Zurich Insurance just said they weren't going to pay out a $100 million insurance policy that Mondelez, the snack company, had when it was hit by Russia with a major ransomware attack, because it said it was an act of war and there was an act of war exemption inside their policy. So that was one of the reasons why the United States was reticent to use the word cyber war. It has very real implications. But I think what Russia also learned from that attack is that the United States has not figured out how to respond to a disinformation or email leak of that kind. And oh, by the way, Russia's gotten really good at plausible deniability, and they outsource a lot of their cyber attacks to the private sector, private contractors, et cetera. But getting to your question, the way that the companies here in Silicon Valley think about cyber war norms is they would love cyber war norms. The person who's really leading the charge on this, on a sort of Geneva Convention for cyber, is Brad Smith at Microsoft. I think he's the president at Microsoft right now. And the reason why is because it's vulnerabilities in Microsoft software that were used first hoarded at the NSA, then leaked by someone, we don't know who, dumped on the internet, picked up by North Korea, and used in these attacks called the WannaCry attacks, which took out everyone from FedEx to hospitals in Britain and healthcare organizations in Pennsylvania. And then again, the same vulnerability was used by Russia to attack Ukraine in the NotPetya attacks, and that's the one that took out Mondelez and all these things. So Microsoft has said, listen, we need cyber war norms, because you're using our products as weapons, and you're basically using us, we're getting hit with the collateral damage, and this is not okay. And you'll hear similar things at Google and at Facebook as well. And actually, what's interesting is that the security teams inside those companies are some of the best in the world. And I'll remind everyone, there was a big Chinese attack at Google back in 2010, the Aurora attack, aimed at getting into some Gmail accounts for some Chinese dissidents. And after that attack happened, Sergey Brin was offering anyone who could come in and defend Google systems $100,000 signing bonuses, and bringing them in. And their motto internally went from "don't be evil" to "never again. We're never going to let a nation state get into our systems again." So these are things that the tech companies here are taking very, very, very seriously, and actually have been way ahead of some of the policymakers when it comes to trying to establish some of these norms of behavior.
Very good. Well, you can see why this subject is one that we feel needs a lot of attention, a lot of discussion. Have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm a recent Stanford grad. My brother and I actually have a startup. We're working on verified identity for civic engagement to try to help with this election meddling problem. And I'm curious, is this election meddling, interference, whatever you want to call it, is this an arms race like any other, or is there something different about this? You spoke before about how $1 million can wreak havoc on a whole country's system. Is there something different, or is this just going to be one country does it, the next country develops defenses against it?
Who wants to take that, Bill?
We had an interesting discussion about this morning. Can we effectively use deterrence, let's say, against Vladimir Putin and Russia if they are meddling in elections? Can we strike back by, say, putting out on the internet revelations about the corruption, the amount of illicit money that Putin and his cohort have accumulated at the expense of the Russian taxpayers and oil? I mean, this is a way to, particularly because Putin has a reputation of being a bully, the way you tame a bully is to make sure if he's going to start pushing people around, you push back. But if you don't push back, he will just be encouraged to continue his malevolent activities. So I think this is something that those of us who follow the issue have been surprised and somewhat disappointed that the West hasn't developed some kind of deterrent of this magnitude.
I would just say that there are different ways of doing deterrence, and one of them can be sanctions, and there has been a pretty robust response, also coordinated with some difficulty between the United States and Europe and so on. The other thing is, and this is quite an optimistic fact, it was turned out to be possible through warnings and a lot of training to deter a lot of attacks in France, in Germany, around their elections that were subsequent to the 2016 election here. And the 2018 elections, I think, people generally think have not been marred in the same way as the 2016 one was. So I think part of it was getting a wake-up call, and it is very important for governments to educate people and educate themselves about how easy it is to get hacked or get tricked, and then work with the companies to make sure that they quickly identify and put in systems and spend money and invest in order to be able to identify where there are malicious actors sending messages or distorting the truth or hacking into email systems in order to produce. So I think some of that transparency can also help and has helped.
Before I return the floor to George Schultz, I'd just like to thank our speakers for your skill and thought that you put into this, and to thank you, the audience, for turning out. George?